Welcome to Lecture 18 on Urbanization from 1870 to 1920. In this lecture, we're going to take a look at the growth of cities and the effect that had on life in those cities, as well as how Americans dealt with the new urban world that took them out of the rural mindsets that Thomas Jefferson had so much praised in the early American Republic. If I had to start with anything in terms of like what cities have to offer after the Civil War, I think I would start with things like Paresis Hall and the nightlife in New York's Bowery. Because cities, being so large, offered their residents more options than they would have had otherwise in small towns, options to be themselves. So young gay men, for example, in Paresis Hall, figuring out who they are and what interests them in a space where there are people like them is pretty significant for modern American life. To boil it down into a single word, the city offers opportunity. And that's not to say that the city is the greatest thing ever for everyone, but those people who are capable of taking advantage of those opportunities and finding space in the city to make a new life for themselves are going to find the city to be an exciting and amazing prospect after the Civil War. Urban areas do become swirling, chaotic centers of diversity and possibility outside the mainstream. You can get a little bit of everything in city life, whether some Americans liked that or not. And there were certainly plenty of people who complained that cities offered cesspools of sin and not just opportunity, economic and social and political. So let's take a moment to describe the urban transformation and what that looked like. First of all, cities grew as downtown areas that expanded outwards with rings of suburbs. And we see this early in the 19th century as wealthy folks move away from city centers to build homes so that their houses don't have to be near the factories that they own. And these exclusive, wealthier suburbs eventually get absorbed into the city itself. I can show you this via a map of Columbus, Ohio's own suburban growth. I have sort of animated how the city took in little tracts of land around it. So let's take a look at that animation. You can see the city is pretty small in 1834. But 1847, 50, 62, it starts growing and adding around it. 1870 brings Ohio State University and the surrounding areas there, then reaches out towards Franklin Park, getting closer to us here in Bexley. By the late 1880s, you can see it has added even more to both its east and west wings of Columbus's metropolitan region. And as we'll talk about later, it gets even bigger in the 20th century. Okay, so obviously cities grow as our little animation showed us. And that rapid growth overwhelms the ability of many cities to keep up with change. More people, more buildings, more streets, faster than they can actually plan for it and keep up with it. So cities sometimes grow very haphazardly. If you've ever wandered into a city and wondered why the streets are weirdly laid out, why certain sections of the city seem to be different than others, as they get added together, the city has to struggle to keep up with this mass amount of change. And it's not always a smooth process. You can see New York quickly becomes the major city in the United States. Philadelphia was in the colonial period. Between 1860 and 1900, New York City grows from 1.1 million to 3.4 million people, compacted on a small island bounded by the river and the ocean. But it's not just New York, it's Philly and Boston, Baltimore, even Cincinnati, 161,000 to 326,000 by 1900. And here's our good old Columbus. This is, in fact, a part of Columbus that's no longer with us. This is the famous Union Arcade and Railroad Depot, which existed in Columbus from 1897 to 1976. And it's what brought people into town. It was a gorgeously designed building. The railroad facilities were just behind it. And this is what ushered people into town. You can see people have got automobiles on the streets. There are streetcars right here in the middle. Columbus, like many other places, was trying to be a thriving and happening urban area. But the growth of Columbus and other cities came often pretty much without real clear planning and direction. City planning would come about later in the 20th century to make up for the haphazard growth of many of these cities, where people would build buildings in whatever awkward spaces that they could, creating dense networks of apartments, as shown here, where sunlight could barely get in and buildings wonkily sort of like cheek by jowl next to each other. City services struggled to keep up with trash collection and urban poverty. You can see here, of course, the poor begging this wealthy couple as they walk down the street for, help and food and a handout. This poor woman's got a little sign that says, "I was blowed up," and she might have been. A factory accident might have actually maimed her. Cities had to provide sewers. What are you going to do with all that waste that people are making? They needed gas lines, they needed streetcars, police, social services. But these did not often come with a clear sense of direction and order. Cities kind of had to figure things out. A lot of these services were done privately as well. Streetcars might be owned by a private company, but given a license to operate in the name of the city. Gas lines might be installed by private companies. And that meant that the cities grew in a not very clear, often laid out and following a predetermined kind of plan. More on that later. Here's a map of the streetcars of Columbus. You can see at one point in time, Columbus had a thriving streetcar system, allowed people to get around town. You could go all the way out to where we are today in Bexley, take a streetcar into downtown and go shopping, and then go back home. Today, one of the buildings that house these streetcars is over here behind Franklin Park. It's East Market. It has been converted from a trolley barn that housed these streetcars into a thriving marketplace and set of food shops. Trash pickup, another serious area of contention in cities. People would throw their garbage out. Sometimes it wouldn't be picked up for weeks, months on end. It's why the wealthy often travel to the seaside in the summer. Leave New York for the Hamptons, where the sea air could clear your nostrils and you wouldn't have to smell the garbage on the streets. And cities often did break out in fire. This is the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which did quite a bit of damage and leveled a large section of Chicago, but of course allowed them to rebuild with a little bit more planning involved. And it's not just fire that damages cities. There are periodic outbreaks of illness, cholera and typhus and flu, of people living so close together, sharing that much compacted space together and getting each other sick. And unsurprisingly, cities had a 300% increase in the murder rate by 1900. You jam that many people together, you give them an incompetent police force, and many times the police forces were quite incompetent. And there's a lot of violence, a lot of murders that go unsolved in places like Columbus. After 1865, cities were 7 times more crowded also with migrants, people coming from Europe, particularly Southern and Eastern Europe, and those people would need jobs and housing and food and these resources that were already strained. There's one estimate that there is a part of New York where there were 700 people per acre, jam packed tightly into these tenement apartment buildings. And if you are trying to figure out exactly what that looks like, our school has roughly about 800 people. An acre is about the size of a football field. So imagine all of us occupying that football field space together. One interesting and very, very powerful invention in this time period would be the skyscraper, made possible by the increasing production of steel, which allowed people to build upwards into higher and higher buildings instead of just 4 to 5 stories, which is kind of the norm around the time of the Civil War. The invention of the passenger elevator by Elisha Otis also allows people to get to those top floors without having to walk tons and tons and tons and tons of steps that seem to go on forever. Cities also tried to cope with all of this change by making themselves beautiful and offering culture. So cities would build museums, art museums, for example, libraries, parks, like Franklin Park here in Columbus, as a way of offering refinement. This was part of what was known as the City Beautiful movement. That cities had grown ugly, they'd grown so fast that they weren't pretty, and there needed to be beautifying of the city, making it pretty so that people could enjoy it, and so that they would be inspired to live better lives. There's a very strong emphasis on the environment being a shaper of character in this time period. And so places like parks were seen as places that would help build people's appropriate character by allowing them to go out and experience nature. Or go to a museum and experience beautiful art and refinement, to read a book in a library and to, grow the mind. So here is Franklin Park, good old Columbus, Ohio. You can see the conservatory building way back in the background. Dates from the mid 1890s, and was seen as this place where people could get away from the city temporarily and breathe in the fresh air and the trees. There was even a lake you could go boating on way over here to the right out of the picture. And of course, you could drive on the lanes at the time. I've already mentioned that cities were much more crowded as a result of migration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. And so it behooves us to spend some time talking about these migrants. From 1890 to 1920, we're talking about 22 million people coming to the United States. 22 million people coming into the US. That's a large number of folks. And many of them crowding into cities because cities had the most opportunities for people. But some of them also do end up going west, trying their hand at farming. out in the West as well. So here's a street scene from the turn of the century, and you could see just the hustle and bustle of the street. All of these people were not likely born in America. A great number of them probably came from Russia, from Poland, from Greece, from Italy. And so you would hear numerous languages on the streets, encounter numerous kinds of traditions and cultures as the city grew rapidly with these migrants. The old immigrants from Great Britain and Germany were pretty much tolerated by this point. I mean, nativism before the Civil War was pretty nasty for them, especially for Germans and Irish. But after the Civil War, Americans found a new group of migrants to distrust. Now it seems like the Germans and the Irish aren't so bad. And in fact, you can see where these old migrants ended up if you just study census data and look at the fathers of people listed in the census. This is the 1910 census for Bexley, where we live. And you can see the vast majority of the fathers of Bexley residents were Germans, these old immigrants, and with a scattering of Irish and English and Swiss, some Swedes and other people, even one person from China. The new immigrants, on the other hand, were from Southern and Eastern Europe. They were Greek, they were Italian, they were Russian, they were Jewish. They were not what Americans had been used to in terms of immigration. So new languages and new cultures, new traditions are showing up in the streets from Eastern and Southern Europe, and Americans, predictably, are nativist against these groups. There's also, if you go to the West Coast, significant Asian migration, so about 500,000 Japanese and Chinese migrants in California, Oregon, and Washington. So in the West Coast, the nativism there is primarily against these groups. As we've already learned, one of the first acts banning a group of people coming to the United States was actually directed at the Chinese Exclusion Act. This chart, which seems a little hard to read, is an illustration of the new immigration. You can see in the period from 1861 to 1880, 69% are the old immigrants, this green color here, and that the Central and Southern Europe is less. Asians are the yellow here, primarily coming to work on the Transcontinental Railroad and in California. But then look what happens. As migrants increase, more and more migrants, the percentage of old migrants drops from 69 to 51, and the percentage of Southern and Eastern goes up to 25. And between 1901 and 1920, Southern and Eastern migrants make up 44% of the migrants coming to the U.S. And most of the Italians and Greeks will make up another 29% of the migrants. Most migrants will end up in cities, urban areas. That's where the jobs are. So you predictably see, like along the coast here in New York, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Detroit. But look at a large number of migrants also going out west, hearing that if they could farm, they could get some land under the Homestead Act and hopefully make a life for themselves. They end up in mining work, railroad work out here in the West as well. Notice that they don't go south. And that's because there's already a cheap labor supply down there, African Americans. Everywhere immigrants go, they're attacked as a threat to the wages of white working men. The more migrants you get, the lower the value of labor. And so a lot of working class white Americans are highly, highly anti-immigrant. So cartoons appear showing immigrants as carriers of poverty and disease and they are not welcome in America. They are anarchists and troublemakers, and they desecrate the Sabbath, and they're not like us, and they just don't belong here, becomes a pretty predominant opinion for a lot of nativists in the post-Civil War time period. They end up working the least skilled jobs for low pay in factories, in meat packing in Chicago, for example, or the railroad industry, or mining in Pittsburgh. And therefore, they are most likely to be mistreated, harmed, maimed, and have very little ability to do anything about it. They tend to prefer living in their own ethnic communities because it's easier to get started among people who speak your language and share your culture. And you can maintain your traditions that way. So you can marry, if you're Greek, a good Greek girl from the next street over. You can build a church together and go worship together. So here in Columbus, that train station that I showed you, across the street from it was a very poor neighborhood known as Flytown, and that's where a lot of migrants ended up. Irish in the early 19th century, and then it shifted largely to Italian in the 20th century. And so they built a Catholic church there for themselves. And it just made life easier to be with people who are like you, who you could rely on if you needed help. You could speak your language, share your customs with them, and build a community there. Most of their housing conditions were awful, like truly hideous. Wait till I show you the pictures. Disease is rampant, lots of outbreaks of typhus and typhoid fever, flu, you name it. Fire breaks out, as you're going to see in just a moment from one of the pictures. It's very easy to do so. These places are death traps. The apartments that they lived in are called tenements, tenement houses. And I'm going to show you how they were designed. Tenements generally house many, many people in the same house or the same apartment. And you can see why fire breaks out. We've got a stove here and a large pile of wood and then wood behind it. So all it takes is a spark to jump out and boom, the whole place is on fire. But look at the number of people sleeping in here. Perhaps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, maybe 9, 10, 11, 12 people sharing this one space together, all sleeping on the floor. Tenements were designed to have this passage in the middle that was supposed to allow air and light into the center of the tenement, and essentially it did not, because the only time the very bottom of this area would have light would be at 12 o'clock in the day, right? And how's the wind going to get down there unless you've got a tornado and it's blowing the air all the way down? This is a toilet in a tenement. You can see why disease would be widespread in places like this. And my last picture is one that kind of like tugs on my heart a little bit, because it's children sleeping on a fire escape. So they're outside of the tenement window on the fire escape because it'd be hot. And so in the summertime, this is the best place to get out and like not be warm. And there's like what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, at least 5 kids sleeping here. But this person in the middle has got a little tiny kitten that she seems to be clutching tightly to. It's just like a little sweet moment in the middle of this tragic set of circumstances. Now, cities sound like places that are awful, but also places of opportunity. And that opportunity was oftentimes made possible by political machines. At least early on in the Civil War era until about the 1880s, political machines are very powerful in many American cities. Political machines are essentially organizations of politicians led by a boss, a city boss, who uses control over jobs in the city to control politics and to steal money. So the city boss knows what's happening in the city, is got access to money in the city, and makes sure that loyal people get appointed to city positions so they can share the wealth. The boss is the patron. So this system is often called a system of patronage or patronage. And the goal of it is to get loyal followers. I'm in charge of city finances. As long as you continue to vote for me, I will make sure that I send benefits your way. That's the bargain that the city boss makes with his followers. And many of the bosses actually provided jobs and social services to the poor in exchange for their support. So the boss would say, look, we have a contract to build a new city hall. We're going to get rich building it. We're going to steal a whole bunch of money. But while we're doing it, we're going to make sure that all the people loyal to me get jobs building the city hall. Bosses, in exchange for the loyalty of voters, might show up with groceries or coal and distribute food and fuel just to make sure that you knew who was taking care of you as an immigrant. The most notorious boss, not the only, but the most notorious, was New York's Boss Tweed, who pretty much dominated the politics of New York between 1852 and 1872. Cheated and lied his way into power and then maintained that power by having people support him and be loyal to him. Historians have estimated that he probably stole between $25 and $45 million from New York as a result of his corrupt and crooked activities. So between 1852 and 1872, Boss Tweed got pretty rich off of New Yorkers. And of course, he kept a lot of that money for himself. Meanwhile, it didn't cost him much to throw some extra coal or groceries down into a poor immigrant neighborhood to encourage them to continue to vote for you. And so this was a pretty lucrative way to run a city. It worked in many ways. It was effective, even if we look at it and go, but it's corrupt, and there's theft and bribery and fraud. Eventually, Tweed was brought down by a cartoonist, Thomas Nast. You can see Tweed here, always the big one. Tweed kept drawing, Nast kept drawing cartoons of Tweed and eventually generated enough political outrage to go after him, and they finally caught up with him. He fled the United States, but was caught and brought back, and then went to jail. You might think, well, this sounds just like an urban problem, easy to do in a city like New York where there's always going to be corruption. But patronage was actually a national problem, thanks in large part to Andrew Jackson way back in the 1830s and his spoils system. Because he instituted the policy of controlling federal jobs by the political party in power. And that political party in power would hand out these jobs to the loyal members of the party. I don't care if you're competent. I don't care if you have any training in this job. Did you vote for me? Well, fine, then here, you get a job. And many presidents in the Gilded Age actually spent a large amount of their time replying to office seekers, people looking for jobs, like, I was I supported you and I got out the vote for you, and you should make me ambassador to France as a reward, or make me the postmaster of my tiny little town. And in fact, one of those disappointed job seekers in 1881 assassinated President Garfield. This disappointed job seeker was not mentally well and had a lot of problems in terms of his awareness of and appreciation for reality, and he stalked Garfield until finally he shot him. This led to a great push for getting rid of this system. Can we get rid of this spoils patronage system of rewarding loyalty with federal jobs? And here is the assassin of Garfield, Charles Guiteau. In 1883, Congress passed the Pendleton Civil Service Act, which actually started requiring tests for jobs. By 1897, it only covered 50% of those jobs, but I guess you have to start somewhere, right? Not going to cover 100% right away. That'd be asking for too much. But it did create in the federal government this sense in which jobs are meant to go to people who are competent, who can pass tests showing that they know how to do the job, and not just because you voted for the current president in power. Another area of reform for cities came from religious and civic organizations that looked around at the dirt and the filth and the corruption and said, we need to do something about the city. Now, some of those reformers are going to look at the problem and say, the problem is clearly immigrants, and we just need to get rid of them. So there's a new nativist movement that emerges as cities grow. And the nativists are continually worried that Americans are not going to be able to absorb these migrants. You can see from this illustration here, just thousands and thousands and thousands of migrants are being poured into the pot. And the question is, are they going to melt in and become American? And the nativists think the answer is no. They're really thinking these migrants cannot assimilate. So, in order to keep out undesirable immigrants, the nativist movement proposed literacy tests. So, we would, starting in the 1890s, test people's ability to read and write. And we would start inspecting migrants. They would inspect them for diseases and send people back to Europe if they had illnesses. These restrictions were designed to keep out the undesirables from Europe, and therefore would protect cities from this mass migration. On the religious side of things, preachers and pastors from various Christian churches started asking, what could we do to make city life better? Not just for ourselves, but for the poorest, the least among us. And this became a movement known as the social gospel. One of its leaders was Columbus's own very well-known and very famous pastor, Reverend Washington Gladden. But there were other people as well, like Walter Rauschenbusch and others. And these guys simply said, what could we do to provide social services to the poor and to migrants? What could we do to feed people, to house people? Gladden was especially interested in closing down saloons. His biggest crusade in the 1890s was trying to shut down all of these terrible places where you could go get drunk in Columbus. And in fact, there was a whole area of Columbus known as the Badlands. You could gamble, get a prostitute, get some opium and alcohol. And Gladden spent a lot of his time trying to shut these places down because he said they were places where juveniles were made into delinquents, playing pool and learning to drink. Gladden and others tried to make city life better, safer. And they did so because they believed that that's what Christ wanted people to do. Christ famously says in the New Testament, as much as you have done these things unto the least of the people in the world, you've done it to me. And it's things like feeding and caring for and visiting the sick and the people in prison. A movement that actually originated in England that came to America had an alternative but kind of complementary position, and that was the settlement house. Settlement houses were places where immigrants and poor folks could get help in a neighborhood. Most famous was led by Jane Addams, who established Hull House in Chicago. They provided childcare, they provided education, they provided training to help the poor people and migrants, citizenship classes. Here in Columbus, the poor neighborhood I mentioned earlier, Flytown, had its own settlement house called the Godman Guild, where they did childcare and they had a playground, helped children play and learn to grow up safely. They also taught classes and helped people, better themselves. The goal of the settlement house movement is to address all of the poverty and problems of life in the city by helping people help themselves. And there is Jane Addams. Another reformer wanted to tackle the problem of poor urban life by documenting the evils of the tenements and the slums. He's a Danish immigrant named Jacob Riis. Riis took photographs and wrote about poverty in his famous book, How the Other Half Lives. And his goal in doing so was to inspire reforms. That is, maybe shame cities into better housing codes, to go around and inspect homes and make sure that people weren't getting taken advantage of, to shut down poor tenement conditions where people were living in filth and poverty and vice. So you've got a series of reformers aimed at Christianity, like this is what Christ would have us do, a self-help set of reformers in the settlement houses, and Riis, who wanted to inspire lawmakers to reform the treatment of people in the cities. And there is Jacob Riis. And a picture of young boys from How the Other Half Lives. He documented a lot of these boys sleeping on the streets, working, selling newspapers or working in factories, stealing to get food, and not really having any place to go. So the pictures like this were meant to pull on your heartstrings and make you feel like, oh, something should be done. These boys should be at school. They should not be sleeping on the streets. And last, what did the city offer people who were in the middle class, the middling sort of Americans who are neither at the poor bottom or the urban rich top? Well, first of all, cities became places of enormous consumption of material goods. Anything your heart could desire could be found in the department stores and the malls. Yes, I mean malls. The first one being in Cleveland, still in existence, where you could see mass-produced consumer culture. You could go in and look at a giant bin of things and pick out what you wanted, glittering, amazing things on the store shelves, produced en masse in America's factories. So, yeah, it was the same crap that everybody else was buying, but isn't it nice to be able to buy things? Probably the best known purveyor of America's consumer culture was Sears, Roebuck and Company, which not only allowed you to go shop in their stores, but more importantly, allowed people to order by mail things from their catalog. So children in 1900 would look at this catalog for hours on end and get just absolutely enthralled about the cool things that were being offered for sale. And when the United States government started offering free rural delivery of mail, people could order these things and have it delivered for free, without an extra delivery charge attached. Sears even offered houses, of which there are about 10 here in Bexley, You could literally order an entire kit for a house and then have a local builder put it together like Legos. Department stores proliferated, giant emporiums of vast mass produced consumer culture. Advertising increased 850%. I've read a fair amount of 19th century newspapers, and every page is hawking some product, health products, clothing products, you name it, they're selling it. Now, what could you do for fun time in the cities if you're in the middle class after you go to the department store and buy all the things your little heart desires? You could enjoy a shorter work week. In 1870, the average work week was about 70 hours, but it dropped to 60 hours a week by 1900, freeing more people up for leisure activities so they could go and do things like the museums and the parks and the libraries that I mentioned earlier on in the lecture. They could also go take in theaters, pubs. There's a whole pub culture that develops for men to go out and have a drink and have a place where they can be a man. Spectator sports is largely invented after the Civil War. America doesn't have any large-scale spectator sports until post-Civil War period. The first professional baseball team in the United States is in Cincinnati, and it's the Red Stockings. And if you didn't want to go do that, you could go to things like Luna Park off Coney Island in New York. Columbus had its own amusement parks as well, where you could go and enjoy the rides, see the thrilling lights. The lights itself, it was a particular attraction for people to see the night lit up, drive away the darkness. And you could also then take in a baseball game if you wanted to in Cincinnati or one of the other numerous teams. By the turn of the century, we'll also get widespread football games. Basketball will be invented, but baseball will be America's national pastime. And of course, the city allows people to assume new identities and find out who you are in an environment where there might be more people like you, more people that you ever dreamed existed back when you were living in your tiny little European village. Cities provided new opportunities for education for women. Colleges allowing middle-class women to go get degrees and become teachers, do social work. That was a popular vocation for women. The amount of availability for educated women to find a voice and a role for themselves in the city can't be underestimated. And I'll give you a really quick example of this. Bicycles. Bicycles become a craze in the 1890s. There were 2 biking clubs here in Columbus, especially for women. And so women took advantage of what the city had to offer to not only be educated, but to travel freely and talk to other women about their experiences in the world around them. Some of those women chose to live with other women in what may have been lesbian relationships. At the time, they were known as Boston marriages, where 2 women just lived together because it's easy to, work and get enough money together as 2 women than to live alone. Who knows? Maybe they were just roommates, but in fact, maybe many of these women were in love. And we do know a few that were, and we've got their letters back and forth to each other with their pet names and everything as they talk about what they mean to each other. So like these 2 women here, for example, this is Sarah Orne Jewett and Annie Owens Adams Fields. Their nicknames in their letters to each other were Pin and Fluffy. So that's the end of our lecture on the urban world of the late 19th century. I hope you see that It's a place of opportunity, it's a place of danger, it's a place of excitement. It offers a lot. And it's no wonder that Americans start looking to the city rather than the farm as the future of the United States.